now that Mouin mentioned that, if we could just put it in the context of the next significant turning point after the 82 war was the Palestinian resistance that began in December 1987, actually began December 7th, which is just a few days from now, the anniversary. And it was called the First Intifada. I went over in 1988, and I think it was August 1988. That's where I met Musa, and that's when I met Arwa. And I just on this particular point, the Jordanians had all of these mayors in the West Bank. And one day Musa took me to meet them. I'm sure he'll remember. He took me to meet the mayor of Hebron. Musa, do you remember that?
Yes, I remember.
And this was at the point where Palestinians were defending statehood. And the very last thing they wanted was to have as their head of state, the King of Jordan. And we went to meet the mayor, and the mayor said, 99% of the people in Hebron want King Hussein as their leader. And we laughed about that as we walked out. But maybe each of you can give your memories of the First Intifada. And Arwa, if you can begin, how far back does your memory, I know you were just born, I know that. But how far back does your memory go in terms of living under the occupation? And then the others can talk about their experience with the First Intifada, because three of you, Mouin, because you worked in Al-Haq, Musa, because you were an activist in the Communist Party. I don't know what Sana's relationship was to the First Intifada, so I'll wait and hear. But maybe we could begin with Arwa. How far back do your memories go of living under the occupation? The First Intifada, it's usually said to have run from 1987, when you were born, until 1993, the Oslo Accord. So what memories do you have? I'd be curious, for example, do you remember when your father was arrested and your father didn't come home? Do you have memories of that?
Yeah, actually, as he said, I was born in the same month of the First Intifada. So actually, I don't have many details about this period. And when the Intifada ended, actually, I was 7 years old. So my memories actually are very few. And I have like distorted images about this period. All what I remember that my dad was arrested many times. And also I have these images about the soldiers coming to our house, asking and searching for my dad. And also I remembering when my mom was telling me and my other siblings not to open to the soldiers and also not to tell where is my father. These the kind of memories that I have. And also I remember my mom was always saying, she used to say how it was very how she suffer raising 3 children while my father was arrested. She has 3 children and she was alone. She was engaged in the national struggle. And she also was a working woman, but also was responsible of raising 3 children. And my dad was arrested in that period. And it really was very, very hard for her. And I believe this is not the story of myself. It's a story of many of Palestinians. This is my memories about the First Intifada, but actually I remember the Second Intifada much better. It was very hard experience for me and my generation. And that's as a child, the Second Intifada was really very terrifying experience. And especially when we were going to schools, it was there was a barriers, cement barriers and iron barriers, and we couldn't go to school in the traditional ways or the ordinary ways. So we have to get another detours to go, and these detours were very, very risky. And during going to the schools, there was always clashes, and we always hearing these bullets of the Israeli soldiers shooting against the Palestinian youth. And also, I have this one memory when I was outing from my school, and suddenly the soldiers started to firing bullets against the people, and all the people started to escaping the other way. And it was really one of my scariest days. And from time to time, I still dream of that day. I believe the First Intifada and the Second Intifada formed our consciousness and our memories as Palestinians, and it also played a significant role of making us be interested of political struggle and political situation. Sorry, I talked about the Second Intifada, but it's also part of the struggle and about the events and about our memories also.
Were you proud of your mother during the First Intifada? Was she angry at Musa for causing so much trouble for the family? Did you see her as brave? How did you see your mom during that period?
Yeah,
when I saw your mom, she was, only because it was me. She was very angry at your father because she felt that why is he getting involved in all these politics and causing so much trouble? But was that her attitude with you?
Maybe she was angry because he is her husband, but she was part of the Palestinian struggle, national struggle also, and she was part of the Communist Party, Palestinian Communist Party. And now she supports me to be and to keep in doing politics and being part of the Communist Party.
Musa, what's your memories?
Yeah, before talking about the experience, I would say the First Intifada, was, an excuse for the Israeli state to initiate apartheid. I'm not sure if they were aware of it. But it was the start of apartheid in Palestine against Palestinians. Before the Intifada, we used to go to Tel Aviv anytime at midnight. We went to Tel Aviv at midnight, and even the Israelis were okay. The Israeli people, they led us, the ways when we got astray. And there was no hatred. They lived together. This is I'm politically saying, but the First Intifada was a deep experience on me and my family. I was arrested from the very, very the very beginning of the Intifada. It's that time when Norman was introduced to our family, and I think Norman was shocked, when I was arrested. But I was, not, everyone was arrested at that time. I remember the night when I was arrested, there was hundreds of Palestinians, arrested in the same night or in a week, thousands of Palestinians, all, political activists, not, I never threw a stone on the Israeli, soldiers or, jeeps, but, I was just, supporting my people, I remember when I, took my eldest daughter Marwa with me, having, papers, to give to the people. I was, to the people about the what is going to happen, and that day, the next day. But I was not dangerous on the Israeli. They were very brute, against Palestinians, and when I went to Dahri, jail, which is near my home in Hebron, about 10 kilometers. You don't believe, I wished I would die. We were 30 people in one small room. We used to live on our side, to sleep on our side. No space for you to sleep on your back. The toilet was in a bucket inside the room. We for 10 days, I remember, I stayed in Dahri. We didn't go out of the room, and when it came to our mind that we would strike against this, this brutal, things, by the army, we were beaten, with sticks, and we couldn't just, keep, announcing strike for 1 hour. I saw, people, old people, being beaten, for nothing. So I wished I would die, that, that period. And we went to Kitsaot, in the Negev, and for, a month, we didn't know where we are. We didn't meet lawyers. We didn't, our families didn't visit us, So it was, very, 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 severe experience on me. I never forget that, experience. So it was administrative detention, no charges, no, nothing. We didn't know where we are, why they arrested us. Thousands of people were arrested in the First Intifada. And I was, I was released, and then, 3 months later, I was arrested again. I was also for nothing. I told, I told the judge, still, people come to just to say hello to me. Why they arrested me again? So the Third Intifada, was the first maybe awareness to many people, the first how I should say, it was a change, a turn point in the Palestinian existence. And
Musa, I just want to say a couple of things just quickly. Number one, for the sake of the people who are viewing the program, Musa worked later in life, he worked for the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem. And I can tell you, for those who want to take my word, thank you. If not, I can only say it. Musa, when it comes to human rights issues, he not only does not lie, he never, ever exaggerates. So when you hear his testimony, this is not propaganda. I know some people are going to say, they're going to roll their eyes and they're going to say, well, we heard that before and it's just more stories. No, Musa does not lie and he doesn't exaggerate. So in my opinion, what you're hearing is truth through his eyes, but it's the truth. The second thing I want to ask Musa is, I was very, very surprised by how you began, because I thought you were going to begin by saying the First Intifada was the great moment in Palestinian history, the great moment in the occupation, the mass civil resistance, everybody was hopeful. And instead, You started on the most negative note possible. You said the First Intifada was the beginning of Israeli apartheid. And
Yes.
I'm wondering what happened. Has your whole opinion of that period now changed?
Yeah, I think the Intifada was great, and the people, all over the world, it was supported. And Israel was, could be isolated if the Palestinians used the Intifada. But unfortunately, I would, be, true to, the truth. It was, badly used by the Israeli, the Palestinian leadership, and it made, lots of frustration on Palestinians to the extent that, now many Palestinians, wish that it did not happen. Unfortunately, I would, say the truth, tell the truth, here. If it continued as it began, I think it would change the whole Palestinian life. But it was used by Arafat and by the outside leadership, and then, it was, gate to Oslo, which is the catastrophe. Like the 1948, I think, people, most Palestinians believe that Oslo Accords were the Nakba, the catastrophe, the Palestinian catastrophe, which is still, Palestinians are suffering and will suffer for a long time because of, this, agreement. The Intifada, I remember, I was, a teacher at that time. I remember, how children were killed in the street. I saw many of them. I went to hospitals, to see them, and I heard. I never forget those views, about, the killed people, children. And at that time, no, not one bullet was, shot at the Israelis. So, yeah, I don't want to remember the First Intifada. But I am disappointed that it was the opposite what we expected. When the Palestinians came in 1932, everything changed, and this. I'm sorry to say that, but we are suffering from the results of the First Intifada.
Mouin, what's your recollection? First of all, how did you get there? You were a Dutch citizen. How did you end up in the First Intifada in the West Bank?
Well, when the shortly before the uprising broke out, I was then in my final year of university in the United States, and I was hoping to do my doctorate in Middle East history, and I'd never lived in the Middle East, so I thought before beginning my doctorate, I should maybe, spend a year in the Middle East, and several friends suggested that I spend a year teaching at one of the Palestinian universities in the West Bank. So in late November 1987, this is, before email, I sent out letters to Birzeit University, to Bethlehem University, to Najah University in Nablus, inquiring about a possibility of getting a teaching position there for a year. And through friends who had personal connections to a human rights organization in Ramallah named Al-Haq, they suggested that for good measure, I throw in an application there too. At the time, I was quite skeptical of the idea of struggling for human rights in the context of occupation. It seemed to me you either have occupation or national liberation, and the idea of promoting human rights in the context of occupation struck me as somewhat absurd in my younger days. But that notwithstanding, I humored them and did it. By the time my letters arrived in Palestine, Intifada had erupted. The Israeli military had shut down all the universities. And several months later, I started getting responses, well, thanks for your interest, but there won't be an academic year next year because we've been closed down by the Israeli military. While at the same time, all of a sudden, the human rights organizations had this crying need for more researchers. So I was able to get a position as a researcher with Al-Haq. I remember, my Palestinian political education, such as it was, had been very much formed by the experiences of the Palestinian national movement in exile, in Jordan and Lebanon, and their diplomatic efforts around the world. And I was less familiar with the occupied territories, and I didn't really have a very good understanding of either its geography, its society, its politics, and so on. And I remember, I first went there in June 88, so this was about 6-7 months after the Intifada erupted. Little anecdote, since it's now World Cup season. It was then the 1988 European Cup, and I was leaving to Palestine via Tel Aviv airport from Amsterdam the day after the Netherlands won the European Cup. And in those days, you get to the airport, and there would be security officials going through your suitcase and interrogating you. And the first question that I was asked by the Dutch security officer is, where were you last night? And I was kind of taken aback by the question. And I responded, well, I don't know. And he said, what do you mean you don't know? I said, well, I watched the game. Holland won. Bedlam broke out, and I just remember having a few drinks afterwards, and then, the rest is kind of a black hole. And he gave me a sympathetic look, and he said, yeah, I have a splitting headache too. Off you go. And that was that. And then on the flight, I somehow got stuck with a group of Latin American Christian pilgrims, and perhaps at passport control in Tel Aviv, maybe they thought I was one of them, and I was more or less waved right through. And that's how I got there. And it was a fascinating experience. Many times, as Musa has said, tragic and infuriating, but also at others very hopeful, and at times even euphoric. I had the opportunity to visit virtually every town, village, and refugee camp in the West Bank and Gaza Strip by going around with the field workers of Al-Haq, and got to know the area reasonably well, and its society and its politics. And my recollection is that it was, at least initially, a very hopeful period, because many of the social and political barriers were broken, and people were acting very much collectively in the common interest, looking out for each other, working together, making individual sacrifices for the collective good in ways that had not happened before, or to a much more limited extent. And I think Musa is right that over time, for a variety of factors, including some that Musa has mentioned, that began to fray. And unfortunately, it did end up with the catastrophe of the Oslo agreements. I personally do not think that was a foregone conclusion. I think there were other options. To me, a key turning point was in March, April 1988. This is before I got there, but there had been a proposal that the Palestinian residents of the occupied territories should collectively either destroy or hand back their identity cards that are issued by the Israeli authorities, and were absolutely instrumental in their system of population control. And for whatever reason, both the local and the national leadership decided not to pursue that option. It was, I think, at that point, there was a fork in the road of making the occupied territories completely ungovernable, or giving Israel a route back to exercising even more stringent controls along the lines of what Musa has described.
I want to just make, I much prefer to hear you all, but I just want to say, just make a couple of comments because you stimulated many memories. I remember when a Palestinian's identity card was taken, as it was by the Israelis,
routinely,
you couldn't move. I remember Musa telling me the stories that he just had to stay in a single place for a very long time because the Israelis had taken his identity card. So he physically could not.
They exchanged it with the green, it was, orange, cover. And, most activists were given green cover. And it was, dangerous to, pass on soldiers. When they saw just the green, you had to be beaten or held for hours, and sometimes arrested again.
If I could just make one observation, you're entirely right what you say about the identity cards, but the 1980s were a very different period when Israel was still very reliant on Palestinian labor in agriculture, in construction, in services, in other sectors, and they were able to take as many identity cards as they wanted and confiscate them because there were still tens of thousands of others who they could rely on. But it was my view.
I wasn't criticizing.
I understand. I'm just clarifying that the reason this could have worked is because Israel then was not, I believe, in a position to collectively ban the entire population of the occupied territories in the way that it is very much able to do today.
Mouin, I have a question about that specifically, since you're familiar with like the labor situation and the educational situation in the 80s in Palestine and Israel. So at the time there was this, so there were the school closures, right? I believe the biggest university in the West Bank was closed.
All universities.
Yeah.
And all schools.
Yeah, and some of them were closed like literally for like 18 months straight, right, at a time. I mean, people are going wild in the West now about, coronavirus school closures, what effects does this have on students? Well, we had literally 18 months of no education at all. And at the time, though, it reminds me a little bit of maybe what was going on in Iran after the White Revolution, where suddenly you had a more educated youth, but at the same time, the kinds of jobs that were available to them in Iran was also as well as in Palestine in the 80s. It's like you said, it was menial physical labor, right? So it was to the extent that Palestinians were allowed to work in Israel. It was all supposed to be for menial labor. Can you just comment a little bit more about what was happening in the labor situation?
Yeah, first of all, during this period, 88, 89, education was literally criminalized, whether at the primary, secondary, or tertiary level. And educational activities were conducted underground illegally. Now, as far as the labor situation is concerned, you're right with an important distinction, which is that those who either had attained a higher level of education or had obtained professional qualifications, on the whole, could not find work either within the occupied territories or in Israel unless they accepted jobs that were far below their qualifications. But they did have the opportunity to find work, particularly in the Gulf states, in the Arab states on the Persian Gulf. International migration was then much easier than it was today. But I think one factor that contributed to the Intifada is that during the second half or during much of the 1980s, the Gulf labor market began to diminish considerably. I should add that this was a model that worked very well for the Israelis, because often you would get educated Palestinian professionals who then would move to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia, to wherever, and would essentially take up permanent long-term residence there. And so it was, on the one hand, one less Palestinian on the land that the Israelis coveted, and at the same time, it was often these more economically secure, more educated Palestinians that played leadership roles, and that was, one less activist to be jailed or deported.
I want to hear Sana, what her memory of the First Intifada was. Just to make one comment, as I said, I always relied on Musa's judgment about the situation there. And I asked him, well, what do you think the Palestinians did wrong? And Musa, you can comment on it now, but I remember very distinctly your analysis back then was they should have won some demand and then just end the Intifada. What happened was, for those of you who are too young to remember, it never ended officially. They would say 1990, it's still the Intifada. 91, it's still the Intifada. But there was no Intifada anymore. And it officially ends, if you look at the books, the history books, it ends with Oslo. But in fact, it ended much sooner. There was never any official, it's over. And Musa's view was, you should have won something and then just ended it, rather than feeling, as most Palestinians felt that for all the sacrifice, they got nothing. So what's your opinion now, Musa?
I think, now, later, maybe I thought it, deeper than, when I was, in the middle of the Intifada, that, the Intifada started when, the life of Palestinians was very, very good. They used to work freely in Israel. They had good incomes from working in Israel. And life was well, People, supported the Palestinians, supported Intifada because they wanted, they did not accept, the occupation. Compared with the Second Intifada, with now, workers did not go to work, and activists closed bureaus, and the army forced, people, to open the roads to let the workers go to Israel, and they didn't want. There was the public education, because of the closure of schools. The values in Palestinians, supported each other. Rich families, give food to, poor families, because all Palestinians, were unemployed, during the first years of the Intifada. Now it's different, I'm sorry, to say that, you don't believe me if I say that, the Palestinians would oppose, many Palestinians would oppose, a new Intifada, because, their life, was changed, When, General Dayton, the American General Dayton came, he said one, famous statement that he would create the new Palestinians. And I think, the West, the Americans, and the Palestinian leadership, the Israelis, all worked to find the new Palestinians who would, their life was stick to life, which is, higher standard of life, not like, the days of the First Intifada. So, I was asked, and, in the media sometimes, Al-Mayadeen or the television which supported the Palestinians say that, the Palestinians are, starting a third intifada, which I suspect that because, the Americans and the Europeans, the Israelis, and they worked, very hard on the new Palestinians. But, I remember also when Golda Meir said that the old generation, would die and the new generation would forget. But it's not a matter of memory; it's a matter of life. The Oslo, I wouldn't say the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada, it's different from the First Intifada because it was militarized. But Oslo destroyed, which is a result of the First Intifada, destroyed the Palestinian hopes, destroyed the Palestinian life, and I'm not sure, now the Palestinians are pushed to the corner. There is, individual resistance, but I don't think, it would last, I'm sorry to say that. I'm hopeless. I'm hopeless about the future. The Palestinians are left now with no hopes. They are frustrated, and they are scared also of the new changes, the political changes in Israel. Now Israel is, turning to a real fascist, countries with, Ben Gvir and, with Netanyahu.
Musa, I have a question about something that you said, since we're on the subject of your arrests and things of that nature. You were emphatic, for instance, when you said that during the First Intifada, you did not even once ever throw a stone. And I'm not sure if all viewers would appreciate this, but at the time, what was going on was there was something called the Iron Fist campaign by Rabin. He wasn't the prime minister at the time. I forget what his role was then.
Yeah, he was the defense minister, I think. Rabin.
Okay. Yeah. So as defense minister, there was this campaign, Iron Fist, and one of the things that happened was there was this kind of very open system put in place where if somebody were to throw a stone, even if it didn't even necessarily cause any kind of damage, if you were caught, there were reprisals against your entire family, right? And this was not done in secret, right? This was done explicitly, right? This was kind of like whatever the law was, I'm not sure, but it was just an explicit thing that was going on. When I was doing research for this show, I was looking up your name, and I saw even to the present day, like articles as recent as a couple of years ago, people in your extended family being harassed by the security forces. Is that an ongoing campaign of Israeli harassment? Is it separate from the kind of like more generic, Israel is constantly doing all kinds of campaigns in West Bank and Gaza, right? People are always targeted. Do you feel like your family is being specifically targeted still?
I not only my family. I wanted to say that in the First Intifada and after in the early 90s, I said before that we are 17 brothers and 10 sisters. My mother, she always repeats the story. She didn't know which prison to go to visit, my brothers. We were 7 at one time in jail. Even my sister was arrested once, So my family, not only my family, many families in the camp, in the everywhere, in the camp, men in the camp and villages, had, more than 1, 2, 3 people arrested. So it was, it's, more than, needed for the Israeli security to arrest everyone, to harass everyone. And it's not like these days, prisons are different now from the days when we were arrested. You cannot believe, the life, we lived in prison. The interrogation was very severe, beating and, putting the kind of sack all the time for 24 hours with the sack on your head. You don't see, chained to the chair for all the day. I don't want to remember these days. It's different now, but it happened. So, my family was destroyed by the Intifada, you're right. And, not only my family, all the the people I know, the camp, every family had, 1 or 2 prisoners during the Intifada.
I want to hear, since Musa said his feelings now, I want to hear from everybody else on that. Just as one point, not a major point, but since you raised the question of the stone throwing, from whatever direction a stone was thrown, the home from where the stone seemed to come, the home would be demolished. And so I remember many parents who would beg their children, because there were some homes which were quite beautiful, especially in the Ramallah area. One thing that Mouin left out was when people went to live in the Gulf, the breadwinner, the father, they sent back a lot of money. And people built beautiful palatial homes. And I remember the parents begging the kids, their own children, and people in the neighborhood, please don't throw a stone from in front of our house, because the house would then be demolished.
Yes.
But leaving that aside, I would like to hear from Arwa, Sana, and Mouin. How do you react when Musa says, I'm hopeless? It's hopeless. He says, the Israelis, the Americans, they succeeded. They created the new Palestinian, which, as I understand Musa means, a Palestinian who is now self-absorbed, selfish, and will no longer do something for a collective cause. So how do you three react to that? Maybe we could begin with Sana. How do you feel when you hear somebody who lives there and knows the people, he says, I'm hopeless?
Can I just comment on my reaction to the First Intifada first?
Yes.
Okay. Of course, I left Beirut after 82, and not me, but everybody felt very much defeated, no matter how much Arafat wanted to show us that it was a victory, the withdrawal of the PLO from Beirut, but we had a very deep sense of defeat and disappointment and anger. So when I left Beirut and went, like most Palestinians, to the Gulf, I got married and started our lives in the Gulf, like most Palestinians. And when the First Intifada started, I personally felt the glory of the Palestinian resistance against Israelis. I'm very surprised to hear Musa, but I was an outsider. I didn't live inside the West Bank. But the news and seeing these young children fighting the tanks, it was really something that gave us again hope. And then I started feeling proud to be Palestinian after the defeat and the disappointment of the withdrawal of the PLO from Beirut. By the way, during the Israeli invasion, again, we had the World Cup, and it's very sad to know that nobody was listening to our news because they were all watching the World Cup while we were under the Israeli invasion. Now, what Musa said about he lost hope. For many years, yes, most Palestinians lost hope, especially in that generation of what we call the Oslo generation, those that started working with the NGOs and appreciated easy life. But what I see now, the people resisting now in the West Bank are young people. The oldest is 20 years, and this is where the hope for me comes from. These are not that generation, these young people fighting, or I don't know, in all means they have, they are not the Oslo generation, they are the new generation. And if we want to count years, the PLO started in 68 and ended up in 93 by changing its strategy from our struggle, which is 29 years. And from 93 till now, it's also 29 years, negotiations and diplomacy. So we've seen for the same amount of time both ways of fighting Israel, the armed struggle and the diplomacy. And I feel now the young people, they know that the way to liberate Palestine or to get some justice is not through negotiations, and especially the young people. I'm not talking about people in their 30s and 40s. The young people, the 16, 17, 18, they really want to fight. This is what I see. And this is what gives us hope.
Arwa, do you think that's a correct description?
Yeah, I'm not very surprised about my dad saying he is hopeless, but I am also in the opposite. I have an opposite opinion, and I agree very much with Sana, because what I think is characterizing the young and new generation is anger. Actually, people are very angry from the Israeli brutality and criminality. And I believe today we are living unprecedented situation of criminality of the Israeli occupation against Palestinian, and the young people actually on daily basis live this criminality. Every day there is arrests. Every day there is a killing. Every day there is a demolishing for houses and buildings in Palestine. And the people. What I see that the young generation cannot take this anymore, cannot take this and cannot believe that Israel, a state that wants peace. And if Israel doesn't want peace and our life is threatened, what we can do? What we can do just only keep struggling and keep fighting. And I see from if you just observing when the people participating in the funerals of martyrs, you see the size of anger, the size of refusal for this brutality, and so this gives me hope, and I think the new generation will. I would say this will the people have memory, and the people will learn from the lessons of the past, and they will create their own way of fighting and their own way of struggle, and they will listen from all the faults that the older Palestinian did. And no, I'm not agreeing with my dad. There is no hope. I see the hope in the young generation. Actually,
I object, you know, because it's not a matter of anger. Everyone is angry. I am the most angry person in Palestine. Anger is not enough to change the situation. I think the reality on the ground, is more important than anger. Palestinians are now, they are struggling for life. 200,000 workers work in Israel, and the first people to, oppose a new intifada are the workers. because their life, now is connected daily on their work in Israel, and Israel knows that, and they are aware of that. The poverty is, more in the camp. Hundreds of people are unemployed. I don't think an intifada would start with, a hard life. I said before that, when the first intifada, the Palestinians were well off, and life was much better, much better than it is now. Friends of Norman, I forgot his name, asked me to write 10 years ago, and there were talk about a third intifada. I said this, what I say now, a third intifada would not happen because the Palestinians are tired, are frustrated, are hopeless. Their life, is very hard. And they think of, what, the young generation Arwa is talking about. These are individual. It is a reflection of, individual anger. It's, a reflection of frustration. I, in my work in B'Tselem, as a human rights activist, I documented all the cases of, murders, and who stabbed, and who tried to, but it was individual motives, not national motives. Unfortunately, I would say I know this is what I experienced. I heard people, talking about, resistance and the Nablus and Jenin, but, it's quickly they rise and disappear, because reality on the ground is different. I know the reality. I know, what people think. I'm sorry to say that. That's why I object to what Arwa and Sana saying. I am really hopeless, and I have the reason. Not just, it's not a matter of a thought. I am hopeless. Optimistic, pessimistic. Really, ask everyone. If you come and visit the Palestinians, you would see how frustrated, how tired they are. And I don't blame the Palestinians. All the players in the world are working for this reality. And they worked and they succeeded, including the Palestinian leadership, who benefited from the situation, the status quo. They wanted the status quo. They don't want, a change. They benefit. They became millionaires. They corrupted, and Israel is, yesterday I heard the Israeli defense minister, saying that he would empower the Palestinian Authority, because they are afraid once the Palestinian Authority are out, I think there would be an environment for, a change, a resistance. I'm sorry to say that.
What do you say, Mouin?
Well, I think the hopelessness is entirely justified and has, I think, a very rational basis. At the same time, I would say this hopelessness also existed in 1949. It also existed in the aftermath of the 67 and 82 wars. It also existed in November 87, before the eruption of the First Intifada. And of course, it exists today. I think the key distinction between those earlier periods of hopelessness and today is that then you had organizations, you had active political organizations that were able to seize the moment and to channel the anger and the energy and the frustration. And today you do have what Sana referred to as the energy of youth, and what Arwa referred to as the anger. What's missing is organizations that can channel and instrumentalize and propel forward all these feelings and turn hopelessness into hope. And these things don't come out of the blue. They need to be built, and they need to be built on solid foundations, and it takes time. And I do have considerable hope that the current leadership has so effectively marginalized and delegitimized itself that regardless of its continuous attempts to monopolize the political arena, that their utter marginalization has created the space for all this anger and energy to begin the process of generating new and more effective forms of organization. Just by way of conclusion, I would add that if they fail, then it really will be game over.
I want to ask one question. There was a third intifada. It was called the Great March of Return in Gaza. It was mass nonviolent civil resistance. And I watched it very closely. There was no support from the West Bank. They just let these young people march up to the Israeli border, and some of them weren't even near the border. They were 300 meters from the border, and just watch them get shot dead. Mm-hmm. So there's talk. When will there be a third intifada? Well, I saw before my own eyes third intifada, and the West Bank did nothing. Why was that?
Who are you asking?
Well, any of you, Arwa, why was that?
I would say first, before Mouin says, it was ended the Intifada in Gaza by Hamas, because Qatar interfered and with money. I met.
You're talking about the Great March of Return, Musa, right?
Yes. I think he means that, Norman.
Yes.
Mm. So it was, ended from the leadership. The people, yes, they wanted to continue, and they, it was, great thing to go to the borders every day, and and many people were killed, many people were injured. I met many of them here in Hebron in hospital. They were happy about it, but it was ended by by the leadership.
And I think, honestly speaking, it had to end because they got no support.
And the reason.
The Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, they were against it, and they were, jealous. They didn't want it.
And I think the reason is that the leadership in the West Bank was extremely concerned, as both leaderships in the West Bank and Gaza have been concerned since the schism erupted in 2006, 2007, that or that protests and demonstrations and mass movements that are directed at Israel can very quickly turn inward and be directed at their own leadership. And therefore, both leaderships have, I think, a very strong interest in preventing the development of any mass protests. And I think that's also a key part of the explanation. I would just add, Norman, I think perhaps in its own way, a more pertinent example is what we saw in, now my memory is beginning to fade, was it 2020 or 2021? I believe it was.
Always 2020 or 2021. The demonstrations which began with the Israeli assault on Aqsa Mosque.
Yes. And there, I think what I found so hopeful about that was that you had different groups, populations of Palestinians rising up, not in order to defend their own narrow interests, but in solidarity with other Palestinian communities who were under attack. And you had, in my view, very much a rejuvenation of people acting, let's say, for the national cause, if I can use that term. And then so you had Palestinians inside the Green Line rising up in solidarity with the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. You had Hamas, for the first time since it seized power in 2007, attacking Israel, not because of what Israel was doing in the Gaza Strip, but because of what Israel was doing at the Aqsa Mosque. You then began to have increasingly large protests in the West Bank in solidarity with Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And the key turning point, in my view, was that you began having increasing numbers of demonstrations by Palestinians and by others throughout the Arab world in support of the Palestinians. And at one point, the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in either a newspaper interview or congressional testimony, I can't remember, says, this has to end, because if this goes on for much longer, it's going to affect our interests in the region.
Okay. Does anybody else, Alex, do you want to ask a last question, or does anyone else want to say something?
Should we move on to Oslo?
Well, also, I think we passed already.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I could give a little comment about Oslo that I learned recently that I think is very telling and has repercussions to today. So when before the Oslo Accords were signed, so first of all, I think the genesis for this is when I get into little arguments with right wingers that I know in my own life, they would often make claims like, oh, Israel does not want to negotiate with Hamas. It's a terror group. It does not accept the existence of Israel. And I always point out, well, if that's the reasoning specifically for Hamas, why was the PLO negotiated with, right? Because up until Oslo, up until the letters of mutual recognition, the PLO also did not recognize Israel either, right? Something had to be brought to the table. They weren't going to give up this bargaining chip just kind of unilaterally and for no discernible reason. And recently, when I read these letters of mutual recognition that were sent by Arafat to the Norwegian foreign minister, right, who was one of the people, I guess, presiding over the Oslo agreements, and Arafat also sent a letter to Rabin, and Rabin sent a letter back to Arafat. And what's very telling about that interaction is Arafat begins in his letter to Rabin with it's very kind of like maybe you could call it melodramatic language. It's a long letter. It's very sort of like we're going to accept the existence of Israel. We're looking for peace, so on and so forth. Many sentences, and Rabin's response is nothing more than something like 3 sentences long. And the difference between the first letter and the second is Arafat is recognizing the existence of Israel, and Rabin is recognizing only the fact that the PLO is the proper representative of the Palestinian people, right? And I guess with hindsight, we could sort of see where all this was going. But I would think that even at the time, and maybe some of you might comment on this, but maybe even at the time, if people had knowledge of these letters, they saw how, on the one hand, Arafat is so placating, and then on the other hand, Rabin is so dismissive, right? And this might have caused alarm bells right from the very beginning, right before even the Oslo process properly began.
Well, I'm going to just comment on that because I do have vivid memories. Most Palestinians in positions of leadership either believed or said they believed that a state would come out of the Oslo Accord. Now, there were a very small group of people who said no. Edward Said in the United States, who was kind of the unofficial representative of the Palestinian people, he said Oslo was a catastrophe, and he refused to go on the White House lawn for the famous handshake between
Arafat and Rabin.
Rabin. There was the Palestinian from Gaza,
Haider Abdel Shafi.
Haider Abdel Shafi, who was a very honest man. He was an honest man.
Yes.
Whether he was smart politically, I can't say, but he was honest and he had dignity. And he said, there is nothing in the Oslo Accord that says the settlements will not be continued. Israel promises not to continue building the settlements. And he said, if that's not in the accord, I'm not signing it. I won't go along with it. There were a couple of others who expressed mixed feelings about Oslo, and that would include Azmi Bashara and I forgot the fellow's name, the sociologist from Berzei.
Salim Tamari.
Salim Tamari. There were very few. In Israel Shahak said, forget it, this is a disaster. In the United States, Professor Chomsky. With those exceptions, everybody went along, either because they believed it or because they thought it would be profitable for them to believe it. Because then you become part of the Oslo show, which was a very long-running show. And there was a lot of money to be made from being part of the Oslo show. I remember I opposed it, not because I had special knowledge, but because the people I respected said, this is a disaster. One of the provisions in the Oslo Accord was to allow for a Palestinian security force. And it allowed for, I think, 15,000 Palestinians in the security force. I talked to a good friend of mine. His name was Ghassan Endoni. He was a physicist at Berzei University. Very smart guy. And he was committed. And I said, from what I understand, Oslo Accord is a disaster. And he said, no, because even if Israel doesn't give us the state, we'll still have an army. We'll have that security force. And I thought, okay, maybe there's an argument there. So now here's the funny, not the funny footnote. It's a footnote. It's not so funny. So one of the people to join the security force was Musa's brother, Nur. And I met Nur. Nur was very poor, unemployed, like most young people at that point in Fawar camp, which is where Musa's from. And if you joined the security force, they gave you a car. You got a car. And you got a decent income. So one day I'm talking to Nur, and Musa was there. I don't know, Musa, if you'll remember this. I said to Nur, so what are you going to do if the Israelis tell you to arrest your brother? And Nur replied, I'll arrest him. And that was at that moment I realized, I think we have a disaster here.
Yes.
That they created a real Arab army. I'll arrest him. And at that point, for me, it kind of sunk in. This Oslo thing is a disaster. Last, though, I heard from Musa, I don't know why, but he told me the security force fired him. So I don't know why that happened, but Musa, do you remember that?
Yes, I do. remember him.
And Musa just smiled. I was a little surprised. I would be very angry if my brother said, "Of course I'll arrest you." And that was really, it was a moment where you realized Arafat always thought he was so clever that he can outsmart everyone. So he figured, all right, I'll sign the Oslo Accord and then I'll trick them and I'll trick them. I'm so clever. I'm so smart. You don't trick the Israelis. You don't trick the Americans. They had a plan. They knew exactly what they were doing. And the fact of the matter is, everything went according to plan and they won. They had the great idea. Why can't we establish an Arab government without an Arab state? So everywhere else you had an Arab state with a repressive government. So now they decide we can establish a repressive government without even a state. And that's what they did. And they got just one more rotten Arab government, but without the state.
I guess we could move on to back to the present day, right? And I guess we could sort of use Oslo as a springboard here, because in 1994, around the time that Oslo was being signed and new provisions were being added, then you had Oslo II. There was this peace treaty in 1994 between Jordan and Israel that was, it basically excluded Palestinians completely from any sort of negotiation, right? There were no tangible commitments that were made to Palestinians. It was just this kind of, unilateral from the perspective of Palestinians, peace treaty. And this is sort of similar, it seems, to what's been happening recently, right? So in 2020, August 2020, we had the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Israel. And that also, it shocked Palestinians because, yet again, they were systematically excluded. There weren't any real commitments made to the Palestinians in the Abraham Accords, with the exception of Netanyahu said, "Oh, we're not going to annex the West Bank," which is, first of all, right, they have no legal basis for which to do that, right? It's very strange to promise as a negotiation tactic to do something that you actually have no right under the law to even do. But the second part of this is when you see some of the responses to the Abraham Accords. So the Arab world was split on this, right? We had Saudi Arabia, they were sort of, I guess, marginally against it. Iran obviously was very much against the Abraham Accords. Turkey was critical. And Morocco at the time, right? This is a fascinating detail. Morocco during that time was very critical of the Abraham Accords. They said, you can't do this. There need to be greater and deeper, meaningful commitments to Palestinians. And what do you know, just a few months later, to try to get Morocco on board to, sort of have a normalization with Israel, they promised Morocco sovereignty over the Western Sahara, specifically Trump, right? The Trump administration, right? This was a move that shocked the world because, as far as I'm aware, to this day, no other states in the world except America and maybe a couple others actually recognize Morocco's claims over Western Sahara. And in fact, they're just, recreating yet another Palestine situation there. There's a group of people there, the Sahrawi, and they do not want to give up their claims to their land that Morocco wants to infringe upon. And I think this is just kind of like a hint as to what has been happening, maybe sort of behind the scenes in the past, but what's becoming more and more explicit now. Maybe we could talk about a little bit what the role of the Arab world today is in relation to the Palestinian struggle, because we have so many examples now of what I just mentioned.
I think it's zero support, apart from words. They claim that, the Palestinian issue is their first issue. We hear it every day. But, even they don't give money to the Palestinian, none. They don't give money, though the Palestinian, government is in financial crisis. And I think who decides the support? It's not the presidents of the Arab world or the kings. It's the Americans. If the Americans want, the any support, even financial support, they would do. Saudi Arabia used to give money, Iraq, and and they were banned from giving any penny to the Palestinians. And just words, we hear words, and but unfortunately and sadly, that the Palestinian government is still have illusions about. They don't want to. They want to justify their existence by saying that Saudi Arabia supports the Palestinian issue politically. They still have relations with Morocco, with the Emirates, with everyone. It's the problem is the existence of the continuation of the Palestinian authority. This is the another crisis for the Palestinians. I'm sorry to say that. No support, zero support. Words.
Mouin, do you have anything to say about what's been happening?
Well, just to clarify, the 1994 Israeli-Jordanian treaty you mentioned was a bilateral affair. And it wasn't intended to encompass any Palestinian dimension. It was very unlike, for example, the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, in which Egypt presumed to be securing Palestinian rights, and by not doing so, effectively gave Israel a carte blanche to continue its settlement expansion in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I think the 1994 treaty, which came after Oslo, was very much bilateral. In terms of the Abraham Accords, as you mentioned, and I find, by the way, Abraham Accords such a pointlessly grandiloquent term for what are effectively a series of bilateral normalization agreements. As far as these normalization accords are concerned, they don't even pay lip service to the Palestinians. And I think this reflects a number of changing regional and international dynamics, which is that these Arab states conduct relations with Israel, both in order to secure Israeli support for their regional policies and in order to secure American support. So they're effectively paying the United States, the Arab states, or the Arab governments are paying the United States in Palestinian coin in order to benefit from American support for various things, whether it's F-35s to Abu Dhabi or recognition of illegal claims of sovereignty over Western Sahara in the case of Morocco, enhanced domestic repression in Bahrain, or what have you. And again, there's another dynamic here, which is that the Palestinian weakness and the Palestinian schism has also made it much easier for these Arab governments to ignore Palestinian interests in their policies with Israel. And if you look at the public level, there's been issues there as well, because in effect, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are not asking the Arab peoples to support the Palestinians in their struggle against Israel. They're asking people to support Hamas against Fatah or to support Fatah against Hamas. But what we've seen is that as soon as you get a clearly national emphasis on the issue again, as you had around the events of the summer of 2021, almost instantaneously, you began to see a groundswell of support, popular support within the Arab world that was all the more remarkable given that there were multiple wars and civil conflicts taking place in multiple Arab states, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. And this groundswell of popular support, in turn, makes it increasingly difficult for Arab governments to continue in such a shameless manner in their normalization policies towards Israel.
Sana, do you want to comment on the Arab world?
Okay. It's first. It's past midnight at our times, and I'm very tired, so I lost some of the conversation. I just want to say that we should always be very clear to distinguish between the Arab regimes and the Arab people. This is very clear, and I was surprised that Musa is complaining that the Saudi stopped paying the PLO. Our problem is that the PLO was getting money from these Gulf states. This is the real problem of the PLO, and this is the real problem of the leftist factions in the PLO, because they got along with Arafat, accepting him taking the money from the PLO, and this is what that led to the disaster. But again, although I refuse to watch the World Cup, but the solidarity of the ordinary people with the Palestinian is really, really heartwarming. I've never seen in my life people, ordinary people from Tunisia, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, showing this support to the Palestinian people, which shows us that, yes, what the governments do and what the people want are completely two different things in our Arab world. And we keep on saying Zionism, imperialism, but also our oppressive regimes are our problem. This is what I think, but I still have very high hopes in the Arab people. This is what I want to say.
What do you say, Musa? How do you respond to that?
I think, the Arab, people are always, they haven't changed, but they cannot do anything to the Arab regimes. No democracy. They wouldn't change, even if they go out for demonstrations supporting the Palestinians. No demonstration in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. No. Just they support, they sympathize with the Palestinians, but it would not change the situation. It would not, support the politics of Palestine. It has been the case all the time. Though, at some time, some Saudi, people, started to, say against the Palestinians, the people. But, when the Mondial and in Qatar, it was, an opportunity for people to express, and the media, focus on this, It's not, there is a change also in the Arab. They received the Israelis and the Emirates, the people. They cooperate with them. They,
Yeah, but this is what they wanted us to believe.
They have business, and I agree with Mouin. It's the weakness of the Palestinian to encourage, the governments, the Arab governments, and even the people. When you are strong, people support you. When you are weak, no one supports you.
On the subject of wrapping up, in Norman's notes, he asked, what after the conversation, like, what do you see differently or what do you learn? Well, I had so many notes, much more than the notes that I sent you guys, that I prepared for this conversation. And I didn't get to a lot of them because honestly, at this point, just hearing the specific, experiential perspectives, does it matter what the proximal causes were of the First Intifada? I mean, you heard the actual stories. You heard how people were living. You heard of the terror that they were under, right? It shouldn't take a lot of thought to connect those experiences with the fact that people will want to resist, right? This is a perpetual thing in human history. There's nothing more complex or different about the Palestinian struggle versus these other struggles. Notice that in this conversation, barely anyone even mentioned religion, it's just not important, right? We're talking about a space issue, a land issue. We're talking about the everyday terror that everyday normal people live under. And that's sufficient, I feel, for understanding the conflict as a whole, as well as any other number of interrelated conflicts in the future or the past or the present.
Okay, I always have reactions, but I'm going to hold it, for another day. I would like to hear certainly from Mouin and from.
Yeah, no, I agree with Norm. I think this would be a useful point to end the discussion and to reconvene in future if necessary.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you guys for participating.
Thank you.
This is very good and very important, and hopefully we could do something similarly like this in the future.